So welcome to this Geneva security debate. Welcome and thank you very much for coming both here in person and online. This is a joint Geneva security debate with the Centre for Security Studies, the CSS at the ETH in Zurich. My name is Emily Munro. I'm the head of strategic anticipation here at the GCSP and very pleased to moderate the event today. Please note that this is a public event, so in the public's interest, photographs and media footage might be taken throughout this debate under the lawful basis of legitimate interest. So please inform either Nicholas Gehrig, who's coordinating this event in the blue jacket on the right, or myself if you have any concerns about this and want to be exempted from those practices. So today we're hosting CSS here in Geneva for a discussion on the recently released annual publication on their side of Strategic Trends 2023. This is the 14th edition of that publication. This is now an annual event. It's an expression of the partnership here in Switzerland between the GCSP and the CSS. And we're really pleased that this CSS delegation could come across the country. It's not too far, but still across the country in Switzerland for this Geneva security debate here today. The publication will be introduced by Dr. Oliver Thranert in a few minutes, and we're going to be focusing in this discussion on three different topics: China-Russia relations and world order, Indian foreign policy, and the last topic, nuclear deterrence, by the three experts up here with me today, Naveen Scheppers, Brian Carlson, and Boas Lieberherr. So our panelist is going to look at the recent and current developments on the domestic front and internationally, and look ahead. What are the current trajectories and are they here to stay? What might influence a different path? This debate is firmly a state-focused discussion on strategic trends and geopolitics. The other public event that occurred at GCSP this week was on human security. This occurred this past Monday. These discussions are more connected perhaps than at first glance. The ability for states to find agreement before conflict breaks out, to enter into dialogue on key issues is critical for the security of individuals, not just their physical security, but also security related to economic, health, or food security issues. Not only in those specific countries that we're going to cover today, but others, including medium and small states. The recent progress report of the United Nations Secretary General on the Sustainable Development Goals says it very clearly. Tepid responses will not do, in reference to the issues impacting individuals, and he calls for bold and ambitious action here. A lot, and some may say too much, but that I think is another Geneva security debate, depends on the responses of the big actors, the major players and their relationships, and the security arrangements between allies and partners. This is the focus of our discussion here today. We say in foresight that the future is not a straight line, and that we always use this term futures with an S to say that there could be fundamental divergences, either negative or positive. So the outlook painted, and if you've had a chance to read Strategic Trends already or pick up a copy on the sides here, I encourage you to do that. It's really very worrying and major challenges that are painted here. And looking at that, it's very hard to reconcile some of these divergent interests and approaches. So I do hope still, though, that this debate is going to leave us with at least a few ideas of opportunities that the developments may offer. So that's a bit my challenge to the speakers. There's a grim outlook, but perhaps we can look as well to highlight some positive or at least some more constructive side, being realistic, of course, where you can. So today's a chance for a forward-thinking discussion on a few specific key international security trends and geopolitics. And I'm sure we're going to touch not only on those influential states and those issues and those developments, but also those entire regions and other countries, from North Korea to Ukraine, as they're mentioned in the chapters, and also on a wide variety of issues, hopefully aided by all of your questions as well in this debate. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers today, and I'm going to start with Dr. Oliver Thranert, who is the head of Think Tech at the Centre for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. Dr. Thranert, you are, in addition to this position, a non-resident senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. You've had previous hats at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the German Institute for International Security Affairs, SWP. You're an expert in international arms control and disarmament, non-proliferation in the field of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, nuclear deterrence, and missile defense. Dr. Brian Carlson, you're the head of the Global Security Team. You have a PhD from Johns Hopkins SAIS, And your most recent previous position was as a transatlantic postdoc in international relations and security, which was triple-hatted, if I can say it put that way, at CSS, where you are currently at the SWP in Berlin and at RAND in Washington. Mr. Boaz Lieberherr, next, you are a senior researcher in the global security team at CSS. You're previously the research and teaching assistant to Professor Andreas Wenger, the director of CSS. You have previous hats at the Swiss Embassy in New Delhi, and your research interests are on security and foreign policy in South Asia, and in India in particular, but also relations among South Asia, US, and China, and in particular on the concept of Indo-Pacific. Ms. Naveen Scheppers, you are the co-team head of the Euro-Atlantic Security Team and a senior researcher at the CSS. You are the co-editor of the monthly policy brief series, the CSS Analysis and Security Policy. You have previous hats at IISS in London, at VIRTIC on non-proliferation and nuclear policy, and your research interests are on nuclear arms control and non-proliferation issues. With this, I'm very pleased to pass the floor to Dr. Tranert, who's going to introduce strategic trends, and you're also going to introduce this year's edition in 2023. Dr. Tranert, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Emily, and thanks to all the colleagues at the GCSP for again organizing this event. We are very pleased that you support us over the years as friends and partners in preparing for these events with the purpose of all the time presenting the newest issue of our annual publication series, Strategic Trends. We really value this cooperation over the years, during which we accomplished to present our findings since so many years in a row. Strategic Trends were published, I think you mentioned it already, for the first time in 2010. So we are looking back at some quiet tradition, and I would say it's a rather positive one. What we tried to do over the years was to identify and analyze key trends in world affairs with a focus on security issues. Our audience ranges from policymakers, analysts, the media to academics, as well as the interested public. The ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine, as well as the more and more assertive behavior of China, pose severe challenges for all those that favor a rules-based international order over an international system where the strong determines the rules of the game by intimidation, coercion, or even pure violence. Against the backdrop of significant shifts in international relations, we decided this year not to provide a detailed analysis of the war in Ukraine or the conflict over Taiwan, but to zoom out with the aim of analyzing trends that are relevant for the world we live in the future. So these are the China-Russian relationship, alliances and extended nuclear deterrence, the role that India is likely to play in the future, and export control that will increasingly contribute to reshaping the global technology landscape. Hence, the overall topic that we identified, and every year we try to identify an overall topic for strategic trends, this year is order and alignment. So we have three of our authors present here today. There is a fourth one, Sophie Charlotte Fischer, who used to be the other co-head of the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic Security Team in the think tank. Sophie, since June 1st, has taken over a position in the German government, a particularly important one, which is why she regrettably cannot be with us today. So let me briefly summarize her chapter. Sophie analyzes export controls that are playing an increasingly important role in the US government's efforts to deny China access to critical technologies. These export controls already have far-reaching effects and hence have begun to reshape the global technology landscape. However, the Biden administration's recently imposed export controls on China's semiconductor sector have highlighted the challenges the US faces in securing the buy-in from allies that it needs to ensure their long-term effectiveness. This has also underscored some critical issues that allies have to confront in dealing with Washington as it pursues its sharpened technological goals vis-à-vis Beijing. The likely US appetite for further export controls, the need for joint controls, and Washington's increased leverage over allies due to its renewed significance as a security provider for the European and Asian regions, as we will hear during the presentations, will increase the pressure on technologically capable allies and partners in Europe and East Asia. We can expect intensive debate between the US and its European allies about the future role of export controls in denying China and other countries access to advanced technologies. And I can also say this is also a particular problem or challenge for Switzerland. It is therefore imperative that US allies and partners in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region not only monitor this trend, but proactively shape it to ensure their own future technological competitiveness and by extension their prosperity and security. So with this, I'd like to hand it over back to Emily and look forward to the debate and the Q&A afterwards. Thank you very much for making this possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thranert, for the overview of strategic trends and for the summary of the chapter that won't be presented here today. So I hope that entices you to pick up a copy or to download it online. So first, Brian, to you, what will the next years bring for China-Russia relations, and what is going to be the impact on the world order?
Well, thank you very much, Emily. And I'm very happy to be back here again. This is the third time I've done this event and the second time with Emily as a moderator, and I always enjoy it. So my chapter does deal with China and Russia and the challenges that they pose to world order. And of course, this is a topic that is on the minds of anyone following international relations right now, considering Russia's aggression against Ukraine and China's posture toward Taiwan. And China and Russia pose challenges to the international order both separately and together. They have continued to maintain their close partnership, and an overlap in their views of world order has been a major driver of this partnership going back decades, at least back to 1997 when they issued a declaration calling for a multipolar world order. And they've maintained this partnership amid the war in Ukraine. And when Xi Jinping visited Moscow in March, he repeated the comment that he typically makes, which is that the world is undergoing changes unseen in a century. And he added an additional line. He said, we, China and Russia, are driving these changes together. And so the desire to revise certain aspects of the world order is an important factor pushing China and Russia together. And I expect that in the coming years, this partnership will remain close. I think there's a lot of durability to this relationship. And so in the chapter, I talk about some of the differences between China and Russia and the ways that they challenge order. And so briefly, Russia is a former superpower that doesn't have a realistic chance of regaining that status. And so now it basically acts as a disruptive force in the international system, trying to reestablish itself as an independent great power. Whereas China has the potential to become a peer competitor of the United States. And China supports certain aspects of the existing order, but it's also trying to revise the order in ways that are more in line with its interests. And so with China, we see an effort to establish a sphere of influence in Asia. China wants to position itself at the top of a regional hierarchy in Asia and weaken U.S. influence in the region and weaken U.S. alliances. And I think its statements and actions in recent years suggest that its ambitions go beyond this. They aren't just at the regional level, they're at the global level. China wants to position itself as the dominant power in the world. Xi Jinping has spoken of moving China to center stage in world affairs. And so China is trying to do that by building partnerships. Russia is its most important partner in challenging the international order and U.S. leadership. It's also cultivating relations with countries in the global south as a way to build a loose coalition of countries that don't accept U.S. leadership in the world and are willing to go along with some aspects of China's vision for world order. And so these are some of the basic differences. There are, as I said, a number of ways in which shared views on world order push China and Russia together. They have a shared desire to reduce U.S. power and to bring a definitive end to the era of unipolarity and usher in a multipolar world. They are opposed to universal claims for democracy and human rights. And relatedly, they're keenly interested in regime security. They view Western criticism of their domestic governance as attempts to undermine their governing regimes. And so all of those issues push them closer together. They're also trying to establish regional spheres of influence, and they give each other support in certain respects in this effort. Now, there are, if we look out over the longer term, there are certain things that could drive China and Russia apart eventually. There are ways in which their views on world order could diverge. As I say, Russia wants to reestablish itself as an independent great power in the world. And so for that, it really does need a multipolar world. It can't be an independent great power if the world is unipolar or if it's defined by a US-China bipolar rivalry. Now, China says that it favors multipolarity, and in the near term, that may actually be what it supports. But in the long run, it may aim more at a Sinocentric vision of the world in which Russia would be marginalized. And so over time, that could be a source of tension in the China-Russia relationship. Also, Russia wants to strengthen its influence in the regions along its periphery, in the former Soviet space and in Central Asia and in the Arctic. But China's influence is growing in many of these regions, and that could eventually become a source of tension as well. So there are ways in which China and Russia could eventually diverge on these issues of world order, but I would expect that that's in the slightly more distant future. I think at the very least, for as long as Xi and Putin are in power, which could be for many more years, we should expect a very close relationship. And it's not just the personal factor. There are deeper structural factors. So even when those two leaders are gone from the scene, there's a good chance that the relationship could remain strong. So there are potential sources of divergence over time, but I would expect that for the near future, I think we'll talk about the year 2030 later. I think certainly up until the year 2030, if we're looking at that period, we should expect a continued close China-Russia relationship.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm going to march through the presentations. So if you have specific questions for Brian, please do hold those and we'll come back to you either here in person or online. So what I'd like to do now is pass the floor to Boaz. You observe in your chapter, and I quote, that India's political and strategic influence and agency at the global level are likely to increase in the next years, despite some very important domestic challenges. Help us unpack this. Why is that the case, Boaz, please?
Thank you very much, Emily and GCSP, for having us. In the growing competition between the United States and China, India is assuming an increasingly important role. India is a nuclear weapon state. It has the third largest military spending in the world. It will become the world's most populous country in this year and might become the world's third largest economy by the end of this decade. And for all these reasons, India has the potential to be a counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific. And if we look at India's foreign policy, in the 2000s, India sought closer cooperation with China and Russia in the Russia-India-China format, for instance, in the BRICS, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But over the last 15 years, threat perceptions have shifted to China. And in this context, India's relations to the United States have experienced an unprecedented alignment and cooperation. However, India's abstention from varying UN votes to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine has raised questions about New Delhi's foreign policy direction. And also, while India is an important member in the Quad, its status and agency in defining and determining the rules and norms of a free and open Indo-Pacific will increase. There remain significant differences of ideas of order between the United States and India. So the purpose of my chapter was to put this in context and to outline how India navigates a world in transition, And in the next minutes, I will try to give a broad overview of India's foreign policy in the past, the present, and the future. So if we look into the past, very briefly, it dates only 30 years back that India has changed its foreign policy relatively dramatically. It shifted from a foreign policy called non-alignment to multi-alignment or strategic autonomy. And I think the main differences between these two is that non-alignment was an attempt to minimize costs and risks associated with being a weak power, while multi-alignment or strategic autonomy is a quest for security and status as an emerging major power, while also trying to avoid too much dependence on other major powers. So moving to the present, how does India's foreign policy operate today at the national, the regional, and the international level? And I think here three trends can be identified on the national level. India's main foreign policy objective and also its greatest limitation remains economic and social development. So all its aspirations to become a more influential global actor hinges on how it tackles these challenges. And in this regard, India seeks partnerships. These are very important in order to achieve these goals. And India is expected to be the fastest growing major economy in the coming years. In terms of FDI as percentage of GDP, India has also surpassed China, but still hundreds of millions of people live in poverty. 22% of India's population cannot read or write, and this projected GDP growth might also prove insufficient to provide enough jobs for the millions of people that enter the labor market every year. And the reasons for this are structural, for instance, a large non-productive agricultural sector and also a financial sector in need of reform. If we look at the regional level, one trend there is that China's rise complicates India's regional environment. Many observers argue that India is losing influence in South Asia vis-à-vis China. And here again, partnerships for India become very important, partnerships with the United States, but of course also with Europe and other countries. So India's trade and connectivity linkages with its smaller neighbors in South Asia, they have only begun to grow in recent decades. That is also a Cold War legacy. And today India is doing more than ever in absolute terms. It has increased the diplomatic engagement, financial and humanitarian assistance, work on connectivity, but with competition from China, demands are rising as well. And against this backdrop and in contrast to the past, India is seeking partnerships in South Asia, also inviting a stronger role of the United States in the Indo-Pacific to counter China's influence. And that is also a clear distinction to India's foreign policy in the past. Third, at the global level, as already touched upon, India's relation with the United States have been improving and become more and more important, while India continues to diversify its relations with countries such as France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Japan, and others. So India's relations with the United States, they have been on a clear upward trajectory for over 15 years now, and this includes, for instance, closer military-to-military cooperation, military exercises, and the United States' stake in the Indian defense market has also been growing. However, the two countries are far from aligning on all issues. There remain major differences on trade, on immigration, and also on larger strategic issues, which I will come to at the end. Although these seem to have lost of importance in recent years in the context of growing competition with China. So India's relations with China, they have reached a low point after the border clashes in 2020, and India is not willing to go back to business as usual. It has shed its reluctance to take a more confrontational stance vis-à-vis China, and reflective of this is also reflected by India's more open embrace of the Quad since the year of 2020. But also in this regard, India might be interested in a partial normalization of the relation as soon as a suitable opportunity arises. Why? China is India's second largest trading partner, and the current situation along the border also places an additional burden on India's already limited military budget. And with regards to Russia, Russia's importance in India's foreign policy has been declining since the end of the Cold War, and Russia's war in Ukraine will further accelerate this trend. But also Russia will remain an important partner of India because 2/3 of its defense equipment is of Russian or Soviet origin. And India also fears that Russia, as we've heard before, if India were to distance itself further from Russia, that the Russia-China cooperation could further complicate its regional environment. So if we look into the future holds opportunities and challenges for India's aspiration to remain an independent and self-reliant pole. On the one hand, its ideas of order might gain more influence as it occupies a central role in the Quad. On the other hand, the more pressing the China or the China-Russia challenge become, the more problems that could create for India's foreign policy of strategic autonomy or multi-alignment. So as a last point, important differences regarding ideas of order remain between India and the United States and its allies, be it in terms of freedom of navigation, in their understanding of what a rules-based order means. And this could mean for the Indo-Pacific that the discussion about what a free and open Indo-Pacific means in practice could be a complicated and diffuse process, and this process could be characterized by the omission of important aspects where agreement is unlikely, and also by disagreement and competition even within the Quad regarding important norms and rules for the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you very much for packing that in there. A lot to speak about on Indian foreign policy, and we'll hopefully get back to a few of those points also during the discussion. Naveen, now to you on the United States, its allies and partners, and specifically nuclear deterrence. Please, if you could unpack for us nuclear deterrence in Europe and Asia, in the changing developments that we've seen, as you do in your chapter, but also the very interesting interrelationship between these two regions. We look forward to your contribution. Naveen, please.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you also to the GCSP for hosting us once more. So to broadly answer your question, I would perhaps start by describing the main trend that I identify in this chapter, which is threefold. So first, a very bleak security environment and rising nuclear threats in both Europe and Asia are placing a very strong emphasis on nuclear deterrence, but also extended nuclear deterrence within alliance relationships, which leads to longer-term strategic, political, and financial decisions for allies to trust in and to build on their relationship with the United States and the nuclear security guarantee that it provides. Second, allies within one region are also increasingly looking to allies in the other for how extended deterrence is practiced, despite key differences, which my chapter does describe, and for how developments in one region have implications in the other. Sorry. Notably in terms of the attention, the resources, and the focus that the US as the main security provider for both can do, and also how adversaries in each region cooperate but also differ in their approaches. And then third, a refocus on nuclear deterrence and the near impossibility at this stage as well to negotiate arms control agreements leaves the international community even more polarized on the question of pathways to nuclear disarmament, setting non-nuclear weapon states apart from nuclear weapon states and nuclear umbrella states even more so than before. So in this chapter, I try first to untangle the different alliance systems to look at the different ways in which extended nuclear deterrence is provided. So I look at the formal cases of US extended nuclear deterrence. So this means allies covered by defense treaties, and where the US also further formalizes this commitment through declaratory policy, through force structure, through dialogue mechanisms, through joint exercises. And then I look a little bit more at then how these alliance systems are becoming more entangled. So first, perhaps, what exactly is extended nuclear deterrence for the non-nuclear nerds among you, perhaps? But very shortly, the extended nuclear deterrence commitment, often can hear about it as the nuclear umbrella, is in essence really the same for all US treaty-based allies. So it's a commitment to come to an ally's defense, including through nuclear means if deemed necessary. And this requires both adversaries and allies to believe in the credibility of this commitment, with allies more often than adversaries being a bit more difficult to convince. What is different, though, between these alliance systems is the operationalization of the commitment. So in Asia, extended nuclear deterrence is provided solely through the independent strategic nuclear forces of the United States, while in Europe, in the NATO context, these are then also supplemented by the independent nuclear forces of France and the UK, as well as nuclear sharing arrangements with US forward deployed nuclear weapons in Europe, and then European hosts nations providing the dual capable aircraft and Air Force personnel to support these missions. So in Europe, I look at NATO, and in Asia, I look at Japan, South Korea, and Australia, which are the three more formal cases there. So why these arrangements have existed for a long time? Why look at them now? What has changed? So the war in Europe and the prospect of dealing with escalation scenarios in Europe, but also in Asia, which would involve nuclear threats, have provided a lot of new appeal and emphasis for these arrangements. So in Europe, this has translated to expanding NATO membership, provided to Finland and then eventually to Sweden. Clearly a recognition of the difference between that formal security guarantee and the security assurance. Also provided new urgency for the modernization of dual-capable aircraft in host countries. Also more acceptance for nuclear sharing arrangements in countries such as Germany, where at some point they've previously entertained the idea of no longer taking part among the population, for instance. In Asia, we're seeing a lot more political and public debates regarding states' involvement in extended nuclear deterrence mechanisms, a desire to strengthen participation and knowledge of what goes on. Again, given in Asia there are no nuclear sharing mechanisms such as at NATO. A great example there is the developments in South Korea that we've seen over the last couple of weeks with the Washington Declaration and more of these formats being implemented for dialogue and exercises. In the US, the 2022 National Security Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review have also then, for the first time now, clearly stated that by the 2030s, the US will, for the first time in its history, face two major nuclear powers as strategic competitors and potential adversaries. So for the US, this really changes the deterrence calculus. It has implications for nuclear strategy, for force postures, but then also for alliance, since it creates challenges in terms of assuring allies, in terms of balancing their requests for more involvement or further visibility of nuclear deterrence assets, and also then separating the very purely security-driven ones from the political ones, and also at home, and we'll see that in the context of elections, perhaps offering persuasive arguments, again, for why alliances and that guarantee continue to matter. So for allies, what does that mean? I think I would say three main things. The prospect of the United States facing these two major nuclear adversaries in the midterm, in addition to also nuclear threats posed by North Korea. I think it requires allies first to better understand how their main security provider has to balance these different deterrence requirements between both regions. Second, it requires allies to establish where and how they can compensate conventionally for gaps that exist or will be appearing. And here, AUKUS and Australia's procurement program for nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines is an example. And third, it also requires allies to look at how they can better coordinate and perhaps cooperate with each other. And so here we're seeing really a strengthening of defense cooperation between allies in the same region, between Japan and Australia, a lot of improvement of relations between Japan and South Korea, and then a lot of increasing dialogue between regions. So the NATO and Asia-Pacific 4 format offers a lot of possibilities there, even though at the moment I haven't really yet addressed nuclear risks or nuclear risk reduction for that matter. So what does this trend of strength and focus on nuclear deterrence mean for the short to midterm? I would say that first, in allied countries that have long been very uncomfortable with the realities of extended nuclear deterrence, it does involve some difficult public debates that shouldn't be skipped. Sweden acceding to NATO eventually, with a past that is very much focused on nuclear disarmament, that's a debate in the future that we can see coming that could be problematic if it's not addressed. Second, we can also expect further increasing cooperation between NATO and the Asia-Pacific 4 countries, but there's also clear limits to that cooperation, so understanding where they are. And for China, that increased cooperation is really a big red flag as well, so understanding how and where to address that is important. Third, and I've touched upon this very briefly, but while the credibility of the US as a security provider has largely been restored in the last few years during the Biden administration, it's still that constant reassurance is an exercise that's required, and it depends a lot on public discourse. And so with the upcoming elections, we'll see how that fares. And then fourth and finally, the resurgence of these very deterrence-forward strategies without any progress on disarmament measures will have strong implications for the global nuclear order and further polarization within the non-proliferation treaty regime in particular. And unfortunately, that space for the in-between pro-disarmament and pro-deterrence does exists less and less, and unfortunately that does also lead to a marginalization of voices from the global south in particular. So that's something I'm also happy to expand on. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
I mean, thank you very much. I think that's a question that's obviously of interest, in particular in International Geneva, so maybe we'll come back to that during the discussion. So what I'd like to do is open up the debate, open up for questions, and really thank all three of you for launching this. And another disclaimer, just to share with you that because this Geneva Security Debate and the Q&A is going to be subject to recording, transfer, and posting on social media, if you don't wish to be identified, you do not have to introduce yourself with your organization or name when intervening. And with that, I'd like to open a question from my side first before we hand it to the audience, both here in the room but also online. What is the impact of Russia's aggression on Ukraine and Asia 1 year and a few months on? So especially perhaps with regard to Japan, Naveen, you've mentioned the China-Russia relationship and India. Who would like to kick us off on that?
Okay, I can start with that. I'll talk primarily about the impact on the China-Russia relationship. And China has followed a policy that has been described as pro-Russian neutrality throughout this war. China has tried to demonstrate its continued support for Russia and the importance of that partnership. It's given rhetorical support to Russia. It has agreed with Russia's view that the West is to blame for the crisis. China has also helped Russia to finance the war by increasing its purchases of oil and gas dramatically. But there have been limits on the partnership, despite the joint declaration they put out 3 weeks before the invasion that said that there were no limits. So far, China has been unwilling to help Russia evade sanctions. It hasn't provided lethal weapons to Russia. China knows that it would be subject to secondary sanctions from the United States and possibly from European countries. And China right now would like to try to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe. And if they support Russia too much, those efforts would be jeopardized. So China has put some limits on its support for Russia, but it has gone to great lengths to show that it continues to value this partnership. It's not going to abandon Russia or help the United States rein it in. And China now is looking at ways that the outcome of the war will affect world order. China put forward a peace plan in February that didn't get much traction. It didn't have a lot of detail to it, but there are reports that the People's Liberation Army did a simulation recently, and they reached the conclusion that the war will eventually grind to a halt and reach a stalemate, possibly as early as this summer. And so then at that time, the time might be ripe for negotiations. And then at that time, China might be able to play a role as a mediator. And that could enhance China's stature in the world, similar to the way that China's role in the Iran-Saudi Arabia agreement did. And so China is looking for ways that it can help to achieve an outcome that will be favorable. I think they want a relatively favorable outcome for Russia. They certainly want to avoid a total Russian defeat, which would be the worst outcome. They want to make sure that Russia remains strong enough to challenge European security. If Russia is a little bit weakened and a little bit more dependent on China, that's okay too, but they want to avoid the collapse of Russia, the collapse of the Putin regime. And so I think going forward, China will be looking for opportunities to play a role in the conclusion of the war that could enhance China's position and in some ways revise the world order in ways that would be favorable for China.
Ian, please.
You mentioned Japan in particular, and Prime Minister Kishida has actually been the one to most emphasize that what's happening in Europe has clear implications for Asia. He's repeated it in many speeches, even under the framework of Ukraine today, Taiwan probably tomorrow. I think in Japan, Australia as well, what the war, Russia's war of aggression has done is I think it's sped up a lot of discussions in terms of what the US's attention in Europe and China's increasing aggressiveness in the region will do. So I think it's sped up a lot of scenario planning, a lot of thinking about all the different scenarios and contingency plans around Taiwan, what are allies' role there. I think it's also pushed for rallying around that concept of the liberal rules-based order, which I know Boas might be able to talk about a bit more, but maybe short of actual measures that are related to Europe, there's definitely been a push for a lot more declaratory policy of rallying around alliances and the US. And I think in Japan and in South Korea and also in Australia, we've noticed a lot of bigger investments and developments in terms of defense strategy, defense procurement, but those were still, like at least in Japan, a decade in the works. Sure, now they were announced and it seems like it's a direct reaction, but it's been the result of a longer term process, and those are still much more driven by China, and in South Korea are much more driven by North Korea. But I think there's just this realization of we have to be acting now if what we'll be facing is Taiwan in 10 years, 20 years, even, no matter the timeline. So.
India has abstained on the various votes to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I think in India there has been a fear in February 2020 that this could derail its or complicate its relationship with European countries, also with the United States. But I think what we have seen is that this has not been the case. After the invasion started, a lot of high-level diplomats from around the world, including China and Russia, but also Europe and the United States, they traveled to India. They tried to understand India's position, most likely also try to influence India's position. But the bilateral relationships, they, as it seemed, they did not take or did not decrease or were not hampered by this. Several United States officials, they mentioned their understanding for India's distinct relationship that it has with Russia. So I think in this regard, India has, or its relations with several countries around the world have not suffered a setback. We also see that India's economy is doing, despite the war and increasing food prices, prices for resources, is doing relatively well. It is growing, one of the, or the fastest growing major economy. India has also increased its oil supplies from Russia, so Russia has been a neglected oil supplier to India, and today it is like the most important one. But there are other aspects in the relation with Russia that will become or might become more complicated. So I've also said that 2/3 of India's defense equipment is of Russian or Soviet origin, and there are reports that Russia does not supply certain spare parts. There are reports that certain defense platforms will not be delivered or might be delayed. So this is, of course, a worrying factor for India.
Thank you so much to all three of you. One other question from my side, and then I'm going to open up the floor. But you're sitting here in international Geneva, and I know you've held other launches, both here in Switzerland, but also in Washington. So my question to you is, what does your analysis mean for global governance? This is the Multilateral Center here in Geneva. What does this mean for the ability of the international community to come to agreements on certain issues? We see a lot of fragmentation in the space of global governance. We also see a lot of minilateralism, not all of it negative, should we say. I think, Brian, in your chapter in particular, you point specifically to Geneva, but you also mentioned this idea of sophisticated lines of cooperation that are going to be required. So to the entire panel as well, though, what does this mean for global governance in cities like Geneva? Do you want to start again, Brian?
Okay. Yeah, I think, I don't know necessarily always need to go first, but logically maybe. And then Naveen can talk a little bit about arms control in Geneva. Just to preface my answer a little bit, in my chapter, I talk about the future of world order, and I talk about the possibility that we could be entering a period in which world order will be defined largely by the US-China rivalry, with both sides leading groupings of other states for the purposes of that security competition. And I talk about the importance of a liberal international order, the continued importance of that concept. But the liberal international order isn't likely to spread geographically in the near future. So when we think about the liberal international order, we're thinking primarily about cooperation among liberal democracies themselves, which can be a valuable part of the effort to deal with China. The liberal democracies still are responsible for a majority of global GDP and military spending. So that's one aspect. Then the next aspect is that the United States will have to work with a lot of countries that either aren't democracies like Vietnam, or countries like India that is a democracy but has had some backsliding domestically and doesn't, as Boaz said, doesn't exactly share US views about world order. So that's sort of the second level. And then the third level is what I talk about in the chapter, the idea that some scholars have called a thin international order. In other words, there still does need to be an international order encompassing all of the countries in the world, even the great power rivals, for the purposes of dealing with problems that are common to humanity, such as global public health, financial stability, arms control, nuclear non-proliferation, and economic issues. And this is going to be very difficult because of the growing US-China rivalry, but at the same time, this era is much different from the Cold War, especially in the sense that the US and Chinese economies are very closely intertwined, unlike the US and Soviet economies. So it's going to be a much more complicated world, and during the Cold War, there was cooperation on issues like arms control and global public health, and there will have to be similar kinds of efforts, but there will be much more complicated because of the complexity of the issues and the economic linkages. But this thin international order does, of course, concern Geneva, the United Nations and its Geneva-based institutions. And so there does need to be a place for those kinds of efforts at cooperation on these issues, and Geneva is a natural place for that. It will probably be the type of thing where it will be different on every issue. You have to look at things on a case-by-case basis and try to figure out where the prospects for cooperation are. But just looking at multilateralism, I'm reminded of the quote from Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the UN. He said, "The purpose of the UN isn't to take us to heaven, it's to save us from going to hell." And so the UN will continue to have that function, including its Geneva institutions.
Thank you, Ryan. A sobering thought. Please, I'm going to hand the floor, I think, to Naveen, and then we'll finish with Boas on this round.
So in the nuclear field, unfortunately, it's the future for global governance there is also quite bleak. I think Brian mentioned that, for instance, during the Cold War, progress on arms control in particular was still possible, but because it had remained to a certain extent, not always, isolated or protected in a bit of a bubble for good and bad reasons. But what we're seeing today is just a complete politicization of all issues, including nuclear arms control, including nuclear safeguards and governance. Like this increased politicization, you see it at the International Atomic Energy Agency in debates within the Board of Governance, when it concerns Zaporizhzhia, when it concerns AUKUS, for instance, within the non-proliferation treaty regime. As I said, like there were many cracks in that regime as well, but it was still working. But it's just becoming very unclear to me how in the future that treaty will be able to work if that space for arms control has disappeared so far, or at least that space for treaty-based arms control or a form of arms control where Russia and China willingly also accede to some measures, because as you all know, there's very little on which at the moment, for instance, the Chinese are willing to discuss. What we're seeing, though, is a lot more initiatives here and there popping up. For instance, the anti-satellite, the ASAT test ban, or a moratorium on ASATs, for instance, by the United States, which other countries have also signed up to, so voluntary measures. But that's really driven by what I would call a coalition of the willing, in a sense. There's initiatives here and there that still have, I think, the role of continuing to discuss these and to at least continue to provide a platform for negotiations should they then be able to occur. But in Geneva, on disarmament issues in particular, the Conference on Disarmament has also been many, many years in a limbo, and I doubt that the current conditions will make that any easier, unfortunately. But again, there's importance to having these spaces, to continuing to push for these discussions and raise awareness around those issues, and the issues are only increasing. So, yeah.
Thank you, Naveen. I think, Boas, you have a final word on this question.
So India calls not only for a multipolar world, it also calls for better representation in the international formats. It calls for the reform of the UN Security Council, for better representation in the International Monetary Fund, in the World Bank. And I think simply because of the sheer size of India in terms of its population, of its economy, India's voice and India's position will be essential in tackling global challenges. And I think very briefly, one very interesting figure is that illustrates this is cars per people in India, and that figure currently stands at 30 cars per 1,000 people. In Switzerland, the number is around 500 something. So I think this illustrates, as India is growing richer, there will be opportunities and challenges, not only for India, but also for the world. But this illustrates that in order to tackle challenges such as climate change and resource scarcity and health, India will be a pivotal actor in finding solutions to these problems.
Thank you very much to all three of you on that question. Pleased to open up to you now, both here in the room, and I'll collect one or two questions, and we're not going to forget about those attending online as well. I've received one question, so we'll get to that one as well. So if we could please start here, and then I'll go to the back row afterwards. So please. We have mics in the ceiling, I'm told, so we'll move to that system now. So just speak up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Boas, for the very quick presentation and very rich presentation. I have to make a short comment and also have a question. Comments regarding India's import of weapons from Russia. Of course, our 80% of the import was from Russia, but within a very short period of time, it has reduced to 50 to 40%. Because now India is focusing on Atmanirbharta and procure its own weapons. Our private enterprises are doing immensely good. So, second thing is the question that India is a part of a member of both the unilateral blocs, that is Quad, which is spearheaded by US, and BRICS, which is spearheaded by China. So, and BRICS, we know that one of the most important agenda is de-dollarization. So, where does the global community see India being a part of both the blocs? How does the global community view its participation? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll start with the question with both. I'm going to collect one more if that's okay with you. We'll go to the back row, please.
Yes, thank you for the presentations. And I'm just taking the chance because there are two people that represent views on the countries that are. My question will be on BRICS and it will be addressed to Dr. Carlson and Mr. Lieberherr. With the current state of affairs between in the like triangle, maybe the triangle of Russia, China and India, how will that influence the further development of BRICS? If you have any insight on that, I would be very glad to hear it. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. So we'll start with Boaz on these two questions, and then I think we'll go to Brian. And I see already a couple of questions. We'll go back to the audience after this round. And Naveen, I think you're off the hook for this first round. Boaz, please.
Thank you very much for your...
Without is fine.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question and your comment. And you rightly pointed to the fact that India is in the process of trying to reduce its dependence on Russian defense platforms. And there are countries such as Israel, France, and the United States are very important in this regard, where India increases its imports and they play an increasingly important role. And I think self-reliant India, as you hinted at, is also a very important strategy in this regard, but I also think that it remains a huge challenge to increase self-reliance. And there are dilemmas or trade-offs in terms of readiness, currently operational readiness at the border, with the demands of increasing India's own development and production of defense goods. Regarding where does the global community see India currently standing, I think that is a debate where India currently stands, but I think it has become more and more clear that the role of the United States, that formats such as the Quad are increasingly important to India, and hence it has increasingly closely aligned with the United States, and that formats such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also the BRICS are more complicated formats for India. We also see that India has the presidency of, or would have hosted or hosts the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit this year. And just 1 week back, India made clear that this will be a virtual summit, not a summit in person. So I think this debate is not yet settled, but we clearly see that India improves its relationship and its cooperation with the United States and its allies, as it also occupies benefits from this central role in the Quad, for instance, where it can increase its influence.
You're fine.
Oh, yes, okay. Russia historically has been very interested in pushing the RIC, Russia, India, China format, as well as BRICS. And this idea has certain advantages for Russia in the sense that it can leverage the power of China and India to gain a greater say in world affairs, and also not in that way not become too reliant on China. Having India in the mix balances Russia's foreign policy to some extent. But it has been difficult for Russia to pursue this approach because of the China-India rivalry. And we really saw that in June 2020 at the time of the clash between China and India along the border. And so that has hobbled Russia's efforts to use these formats. But we also see that China is putting more and more emphasis on BRICS. This is part of China's strategy of outreach to the global south and other parts of the world to try to build loose coalitions that are at least relatively supportive of China, or at least not firmly in the US camp. And so BRICS is also an important part of China's strategy. But as long as the China-India rivalry is a problem, it is likely to limit the impact of these organizations. I'm not the India foreign policy expert here. I defer to Boa's judgment, but my reading of the situation is that India's stance will be it will set its foreign policy in direct proportion to the threat that it perceives from China. The more the threat that it perceives from China, the closer it will get to the West, to the United States, to the Quad. If China could take steps to alleviate India's concerns, then potentially India would try to go back to its preferred approach, which is strategic autonomy. But I think India is the key factor here in the future effectiveness of BRICS.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it back to the floor now, and I have a question in the back to start things off. And if you have a question, please just indicate that to me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I was just wondering if, this is to the whole panel, if you could say a bit more about sort of the potential as you see it for Iran and North Korea to play sort of spoiler roles going forward in the sort of future.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm going to bring in a question online, and then I'll go back to the audience because I have one directly for Boas actually, and I'm going to read directly from the person who's posed this question. Non-alignment has been a theme in India's foreign policy for decades now. India's tensions with China are proving a strain to that approach. To what extent do budgetary constraints and fears of further detrimental economic effects drive India's non-alignment at the present time? If that's okay with the panel, I'll collect one more from the front row here, and then we'll come back to the three of you.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Dr. Carlson. Doctor, we have been hearing a lot about this transition from the unipolar to multipolar system, and it's usually portrayed in a negative way, let's say a Western-centric view. So how do you see the main characteristic of the coming multipolar system, taking into consideration that there is some kind of request to amend the current global order? Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much. Lily, do you want to start off this first round?
Sure. Oh, no mics. Regarding the potential for Iran and North Korea to play spoiler roles, I would say yes, there definitely is. At the moment with Iran, we're seeing a lot of back and forth on its nuclear program. And what I mean by back and forth is a lot of progress, a lot of moving towards increasing leverage, and then small concessions just before any board of governors meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So it's not reached a point of no return, but even in the last few days, they continue tests and others. It's I think there's always that very delicate balance of how much leverage they're willing to build up and how cautious they are and how they play that. For North Korea, certainly, and I would say that I'm even more worried in particular there, but also because of how the North and the South at the moment are really building up strategies that are really not leaving any room for dialogue and are about who strikes first. I think there's also that idea that the focus on China, the focus on Taiwan would leave room for North Korea perhaps to do something in the background. And I think that's what the South in particular is planning for when it looks at Taiwan contingencies in particular. But it's increasingly worrying. Like I'm sure you've all seen reports of the number of missile tests by the North, at the moment it's just more for more. A test, an exercise, a test, stronger deterrence, and it's an issue I see with a lack of space for dialogue. But also I wouldn't be able to offer an answer or a solution for how to create that space at the time either, but there's a strong potential, and I think at the moment in terms of both as well, China and Russia, and I think Brian might be able to speak more on that, also have a role to play in how they're able to moderate some of these, let's say, urges in a sense.
Thank you so much, Naveen. And Boaz, turning to you, you have a question directly for you, and then also more on the general questions that we've received.
Thank you very much for the question on non-alignment. There was a report from several important Indian authors back in 2012 on non-alignment 2.0. It was called, this report, and this report argued more or less for a equidistance between China and the United States, and I think that the current government is very explicit that it is not non-aligned on any of these issues. India, it says it has strategic partnerships, it is multi-aligned depending on issues, and the relationship with China is certainly a very complicated one, and I think one of the problems of the closer cooperation between Washington and New Delhi is that China increasingly sees India in the context of its own bilateral competition with the United States. And I think also the border conflict, or the clashes that have erupted in 2020, that where several Indian and Chinese soldiers lost their lives, they can be read in this context. And we have seen after these border clashes, as I've hinted or already mentioned in my presentation, that India, which has for a long time been reluctant to engage in the Quad, really made efforts to more openly cooperate in this format and seek the cooperation of these countries to balance China. But of course, there are budgetary constraints. China is India's second largest trading partner, and this obviously sets limits to this balancing behavior. And I think one important problem or dilemma for India in the current border dispute, and where more troops, or 55,000 troops on each side are deployed, or even more, permanent infrastructure is built, new weapon systems are introduced. I think this limits India's aspiration and push to increase its naval capabilities in the Indian Ocean, where competition with China is increasing as well. And I think this limits its financial resources in this regard, and also the strategic push that it would like to undertake and is undertaking, but that might be complicated by this current situation, confrontation along the border.
Thank you both. So Brian, the specific question on the multipolar system, world order, but also on Iran and North Korea.
In my chapter, I outlined three possible shapes of the future world order, and I borrow these from a Chinese author, Zhao Huosheng, in Shanghai. And he talks about a fragmented order, a diverse order, or an antagonistic order. And in a fragmented order, no single country or group of countries would have the ability or willingness to provide order, and there would be fragmentation. And we could see some of that, but I think if that were to occur, eventually somehow the void would be filled, and it would most likely be China that would fill the void and impose some of its own forms of and its own visions of order. The diverse order is equivalent to the idea of multipolarity. And in this idea, different orders would coexist. Different countries would not criticize other countries' domestic governance. They wouldn't interfere in any way. They would say every country is free to choose its own political system and development path. It's sort of a live and let live vision. But I think, as I discuss in the chapter, I think there are a number of problems with this approach. If the United States and other Western countries would essentially agree to this kind of a system, they would probably have to accept expansive Russian and Chinese spheres of influence. Russia and China talk about upholding state sovereignty, but they tend to view that as the prerogative of great powers like themselves. They don't respect the ability of smaller countries along their periphery to exercise sovereignty. And so China and Russia are likely to want to try to form those kinds of spheres of influence, which are antithetical to the idea of a liberal international order. And the United States and other liberal democracies would probably also have to go along with Chinese and Russian efforts to weaken global human rights norms, which is not something that they can do. And furthermore, I think it's a little bit unrealistic to think that different forms of order can coexist separately. There's going to be a constant competition to set the global rules, norms, and standards in the digital economy and all kinds of other spheres. And so the world is so interconnected more than ever before, and so the different conceptions of order are going to clash. And so I don't think that this concept of multipolarity is entirely realistic, although it's certainly true that as China becomes more powerful, it will have a greater say in world affairs. That's just the reality. And so the final form of order is an antagonistic order. It's a little bit like the Cold War, although, as I said, different in very important ways, but it would be defined by the US-China rivalry. The United States would lead its own grouping of countries, allies, and partners, largely liberal democracies, but not exclusively. And China would have its own grouping. It would continue to try to make sure that Russia was on its side and supportive. And as I said, it's cultivating support in the global South. And so the system could be defined by a confrontation between these two groupings that are organized for purposes of security competition. And I reached the conclusion in the chapter that probably the antagonistic order is the most likely one that we're likely to see.
Thank you very much, Brian. So I'm going to open up the floor again and back to the audience. And I think I have already 2 or 3 questions here. So first to the front row, and then we'll go back here to this row. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to all the panelists. My name is Asal Mahmoud, and I'm a program lead at the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping, and Peacebuilding of Egypt. And my question goes to all the panelists. So what role do you see Africa playing or can potentially play in the dynamics you walked us through? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists, for your insights. My question is on the deterrence, nuclear deterrence. So with the growing tensions in this South China Sea, now the Japan has, started investing a lot into enhance their military capabilities, and probably they might aspire for the nuclear to the nuclear level as well, to balance the nuclear capabilities of North Korea and also China's position in South China Sea and the ongoing tensions regarding the Taiwan and China also. How do you see the US or the West response to the growing ambition of Japan to get nuclear weapons, and do you see any probability of its aspirations? First question. And second is what will be the impact in the global security if the ambition of other countries also goes to acquire nuclear weapons, and what will be the impact in the global security order? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this specific question. We'll, I think, go to Naveen on that in a second. I have one other question, I think, over here, and then we'll do a final round before we wrap up. So please.
Yes, Emily, the panelists, thank you very much. It seems that as a Mackinder was in his theories, in heartland theory, as we see, there's this competition now. The role was mentioned very clearly of the Central Asian countries. We see that the Central Asian countries, the Turkic origin, rich with energy resources, and we have new players coming to the region. How do you see the role of Central Asian countries, or Central Asia in general, influencing geopolitics in the region? That would be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all the questions. We have a question on the role of Africa. We have a question on the risk of nuclear proliferation, and we have a question related to Central Asia. Who would like to kick us off? Brian, do you want to start here? That's okay, then we'll go back to Naveen. So Brian, please.
Okay. I'll take the Central Asia question first because I was just in the region in April on a trip sponsored by the U.S. State Department. And I mostly, when I gave lectures in the region, I talked about China-Russia relations in Central Asia and how they're changing. And I think the basic trend is that Russia's influence in the region is weakening somewhat. It's distracted by the war in Ukraine. It's becoming more and more difficult for Russia to play its traditional security role in the region, which is its main claim to continued great power there. And of course, it doesn't have the money to invest in the region like China does. China has a chance now to greatly increase its influence in the region. That influence has already increased. China has built oil and gas pipelines from the region. They're trying to add another gas pipeline now. They have a railroad that they are talking about building, China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, which would then connect up and allow them to reach the Middle East through that central route. And China is also gradually playing a greater security role in Central Asia. They have a post in Tajikistan for the People's Armed Police, which is a paramilitary organization. They're very concerned with ensuring security along the Afghan border with Tajikistan and along China's own western border with Central Asian countries. So the basic agreement has been that Russia would continue to play the main security role, China would play the role of promoter of economic development, but that balance could come into question now. As China becomes more influential in the region and as it invests more and more, it will be more interested in playing a greater security role itself to protect those investments. So that will be a test of the China-Russia relationship. They've done a pretty good job of managing that source of potential friction, but it will be a challenge going forward. But Russia is becoming so dependent on China as a result of the struggles that it's faced in Ukraine, that it's just not really in a position to oppose China there. But China still has incentives to try to reassure Russia so that it doesn't lose Russia's support. But I do think that the Central Asian countries play an important role. It's hard for the United States and Europe to be heavily involved there because it's far away. China and Russia are right there. And so those countries can't afford to antagonize either Russia or China. But if China became dominant over Central Asia, I think that would enhance its power, and it would be to the detriment of the United States and its liberal democratic allies in the competition with China. Yeah, I can only say a little bit about Africa because I'm certainly no expert on the region. But as I said, China's efforts to strengthen its international position are based largely on efforts to cultivate the global south. So they've tried to strengthen relations with countries in Latin America, Africa, and other parts of Asia. And so Africa is part of that. And of course, China has invested a lot in Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative. It has tried to cultivate influence with countries in Africa. And so probably in the coming years, we will see Africa become, to some extent, a battleground in the U.S.-China rivalry. Russia also plays a role in Africa, but the United States and Europe will probably be tempted to look for ways to counter that influence.
Thank you, Brian. Naveen, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. Regarding the one on Japan, and then also the impact on the global order if more countries were to develop nuclear weapons. So it is true that there have been debates over the years, not just recently, in East Asia regarding the feasibility or interests. They do vary, either for an indigenous nuclear weapons program, sometimes for a deployment of US nuclear weapons on soil. So there's been some nuances. In Japan, I think the more recent ones, I think, were through a remark by former Prime Minister Abe about how it would be beneficial to, or to at least rethink the deployment of US nuclear weapons in Japan, but that debate in Japan is still very much limited to the far right. And I think because of Japan's historic past, the idea of an indigenous nuclear weapons program has not gone very far. I think the country that's a bit more worrying in that sense has been South Korea, where particularly earlier this year, we've seen these debates really go at the level of the president. And public opinion polls there have always been also increasingly high about approval for an indigenous nuclear weapons program. And there, it is also embraced by some parts of the political spectrum. And that's why in these last few weeks with President Yoon's visit to the US and the Washington Declaration and all these efforts to provide more ways to reassure the South Koreans of the credibility of the US extended nuclear deterrence commitment, we're seeing that reassurance working a little bit. I think it will always take time to see how effective, for instance, the new dialogue mechanisms will be, how more empowered the South Koreans feel in being now more consulted, whether that appeases some of those sentiments. I think there's always going to be, whenever the North Koreans have a test or do something that is quite controversial, that you always then see a reaction also in public opinion there. And nuclear weapons seem to often be portrayed by politicians and used in political discourse as this potential solution. But what is often not talked about, though, is the many implications this would have for South Korea were it to develop nuclear weapons. It would definitely endanger the alliance with the United States, the sanctions it would face, because it would then have to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The fact also that the South Koreans depend on nuclear energy, and for that they have a 1-2-3 agreement with the United States, which regulates a lot of what they can do. So it would have a huge impact actually on energy security as well. So I think the bigger, vast array of ramifications are not what's pulled or given as a context in those public opinions. But not to say that that issue is not going to go away. And so the broader question of whether, for instance, we will see more proliferation, to be honest, at the moment, because of this reinforcement of camps between the pro-deterrence and the pro-disarmament, there's not too many countries in between. So you really have countries that are now benefiting from that nuclear umbrella. And as long as that nuclear umbrella stands and there's faith in it, I would not really see those countries going forward to want to pursue their own nuclear weapons. And those are often the countries that also have the technical abilities to do so at the moment. And a lot of the other countries actually are the ones that are signing, promoting, and ratifying the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So the few in between, we are looking at Iran, we are looking at Saudi Arabia, others, and that's where I think there's some concern as well. I think that's where it then also goes to the viability and the future of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. As long as most countries, and here we are talking about the vast majority of countries, still believe in it and still believe that the system works despite its many different faults, I think, at least in the short to medium term, I wouldn't necessarily expect countries beyond to develop nuclear weapons yet. But it's like every year we it's something to evaluate. Every year it's something to see and to be concerned of if countries, particularly in Africa, in East Asia, in Latin America are not happy with how progress is being done, then it's something to bear in mind. So perhaps very briefly on the role for Africa, I think you have countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, who are very active and very vocal within the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime and different groups, also within the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I think as a continent that does not possess nuclear weapons, there is definitely strength in numbers in those multilateral forums to be had. And I think increasingly so, especially if more countries will develop nuclear energy in particular. It's also an element that has then influence and impact in the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime, I think. It's there's definitely a role to play in a role of raising awareness that and bringing countries together as well to demand progress in a sense. So.
Thank you very much. We're nearing the end of our time, so I'm not going to have time to get through all the questions we have here in the room, so maybe you can stay a few minutes after if I look at the panel, because there's a couple of questions there. What I would like to ask you to do is just have a last word, and we'll go to each of the three of you. I can't help but ask you a question on strategic foresight. Geopolitics have long pathways, and this is the focus of the Strategic Trends 2023 publication. So 5 or even 7 years down the road, where might we be? What are the possible futures? So if you're writing, if you like, on strategic trends in 2030, what might be the positions of China, Russia, India, and even on US on nuclear deterrence? Where might this be going, and where could there be also possible divergences in the past there? So last word from all three of you. Who would like to kick us off?
No, please.
Can we go you first and then?
Yes, regarding the trajectory of India's foreign policy, I think there are factors to watch out for that might have an influence on how India's foreign policy develops, because I think also India's current foreign policy has to a certain extent be a reaction to China's more aggressive behavior in India's neighborhood. So I think one of the factors we have to watch out for is how China will behave and try to constitute its relationship with India. I think that will be a very important factor of how India's foreign policy will develop in the future, especially also along the shared border, undemarcated border in the Himalayas. And another very important aspect is how India tackles its domestic challenges. So India's great economic potential, so how does it go forward in this regard? India's challenge regarding the modernization of its armed forces, I think that's also a very interesting area to observe. So I think these two factors will be very important in terms of how India's foreign policy develops in the future.
Thank you. Well, so Brian, to you.
Well, on my topic, I would look at a few factors in the coming years. First of all, what will be the outcome of the war in Ukraine, and how will that affect Russia's standing and its relationship to European security in the coming years? Will it achieve a sufficiently favorable outcome that in the coming years there'll be further concerns for European security about a threat from Russia? And then, of course, looking at China, the period out to 2030 has been called by some analysts the decade of concern. And so this is, I think, a period to be concerned about in which China might consider an invasion of Taiwan. I don't think it's likely in the next year or two, but as we go out to 2030, that could be a period when that becomes a greater concern. And more broadly, what will be China's power trajectory? There's a big debate about this right now. Is China acting out of confidence and boldness that its rise is continuing, or is it acting out of anxiety that its rise could be peaking and it could it could have a window of opportunity to revise the regional and international order that could fade away in the coming years? So that will be something to watch. And then the strength of the China-Russia partnership. As I said, I expect it to remain pretty strong, probably out to 2030 and beyond. How much closer will they get? Will they consider forming an alliance or even fighting together under certain circumstances of military conflict? These are sort of troubling scenarios to think about. Or alternatively, could Russia eventually have a reorientation and decide that it's more concerned about China's power? I don't think that's likely before 2030, but beyond, it's something to watch.
Thank you, Brian. To you, Naveen.
Very difficult question, obviously, but I would echo some of the factors Brian has mentioned. Obviously, the outcome of the current war, Russia's war of aggression, has a huge impact on future of nuclear deterrence, nuclear disarmament. I think whether or not U.S.-Russia, an arms control type of treaty would perhaps end up on the table in the coming years within that process or not, then has a trickle-down impact on any other further progress on arms reductions or disarmament. China's military trajectory, and also in terms of its nuclear weapons program over the years, whether or not it will open a slight window or not in terms of discussing or being a bit more open to reduce risk, or to at least have a conversation on it at a higher level, will I think also inform that great power arms control discussion. I think also in terms of US policy, who the next US president is will have huge ramifications on the US's openness to engage in any form of dialogue on nuclear weapons. Also how they view alliances in the future, and how or not, if they seek to reverse course in terms of the US's nuclear weapons program at the moment, whether they will actually reverse the trend and go back to building up rather than building down, which is debated now at the moment as well. So those are factors which I think will be huge in looking at 7 to 8 years from now. So yes, none of them pleasant.
Thank you very much to all three of you for going a little bit further beyond the time frame that you were looking at directly. We're at time, so thank you very much to all of you for coming, both here in person but also online. I don't want to forget about those people in this hybrid setting. Thank you for all your questions as well. A warm thanks to Oliver, to you, Brian, Boaz, and Naveen for your rich contributions and presenting your chapters to us. I want to thank Nicholas, who has been coordinating this event, and also David and Florian, who are working behind the scenes, behind that screen, who have made this happen. I do also want to make one special recognition at the end of this session. This will be the last collaboration with Dr. Oliver Thranert on strategic trends, as he's retiring close to the end of this year. So really want to recognize him for your strong collaboration between GCSP and CSS. We hope that there's a few other opportunities to have you here in Geneva over the next months until the end of the year, and of course after that as well. But I would not just recognize that close collaboration and the support that you have for that partnership between our two centers. If you haven't picked up a copy, please do, or download the PDF online. So look forward to seeing many of you here again. We have another event coming up next Monday on the AI wave in defense innovation, assessing military artificial intelligence strategies, capacities, and trajectories. So please keep that in mind if you haven't signed up already. Warm thanks for coming, and thank you very much to the CSS colleagues for being here.
Thank you.